In 1897, in a small photography studio in Yorkshire, England, a photograph was taken of two children. A boy of about 10 years old standing beside his younger sister, approximately 6 years old. The boy is holding his sister's hand gently, looking at the camera with a solemn expression. The girl stands rigidly beside him, her hand in his, her eyes open, but with an oddly distant gaze. They're both dressed in their finest clothing, the formal, uncomfortable attire that Victorian children wore for special occasions. For more than 125 years, this photograph existed in archives and private collections as a touching portrait of sibling affection. A sweet image of a protective older brother and his little sister captured in the formal photographic style of the late Victorian era. But in 2024, when the photograph was submitted for professional digital restoration to recover details lost to fading and damage, specialists discovered something in the enhanced image that transformed this seemingly innocent portrait of childhood into something far more tragic and heartbreaking. The restoration revealed details that had been invisible for over a century. Details that completely changed the meaning of what this photograph actually showed and why it was taken. What appeared to be a simple family portrait was actually something Victorian families did in their deepest moments of grief, something that seems shocking to modern viewers, but was once considered a normal, even necessary, act of love and remembrance. Subscribe now. Because this photograph tells a story about loss, about how families coped with tragedy in an era when death was a constant companion, and about a brother's final moment with his sister. The photograph arrived at the National Portrait Gallery in London in February 2024 as part of a donation of Victorian-era family photographs from the estate of Margaret Henderson, whose family had lived in Yorkshire for generations. Among dozens of typical Victorian portraits, stern-faced adults, formal family groups, babies in elaborate christening gowns, this particular photograph stood out for its apparent sweetness. The image showed two children standing side by side in what appeared to be a photographer's studio. The background was plain and dark, typical of the era. The boy appeared to be approximately 10 years old, dressed in a formal dark suit with a high collar and buttoned jacket, the kind of uncomfortable clothing Victorian children wore for important occasions. His hair was neatly combed, parted on the side. His expression was solemn and sad, his eyes looking directly at the camera with what appeared to be recent tears. His eyes looked slightly red and puffy. Beside him stood a younger girl, perhaps 6 years old, wearing a beautiful white dress with lace detailing and ribbons. Her hair was carefully arranged with a bow. She stood very straight and still, her posture almost unnaturally rigid. Her eyes were open, looking toward the camera, but her gaze seemed unfocused and distant. The kind of vacant stare that sometimes appears in very old photographs when subjects had to hold still for long exposures. The most touching detail was their hands. The boy was holding the girl's hand gently but firmly, as if protecting her or offering comfort. This gesture of sibling affection was what initially made the photograph seem so sweet and memorable. Written on the back of the photograph in faded ink, Thomas and Mary Smith, 1897, Yorkshire. Dr. Catherine Palmer, the archivist cataloging the Henderson donation, made her initial assessment. Lovely example of late Victorian sibling portrait. Boy appears protective of younger sister. Touching display of family affection. Some interesting technical details. Girl's posture very rigid, possibly due to long exposure time or photographer's direction. Recommend for digitization and possible exhibition in Victorian childhood collection. The photograph was indeed interesting from a technical standpoint. Victorian photography required subjects to remain very still during exposure. Even with improvements by the 1890s, any movement could blur the image. This explained why Victorian photographs often showed people with stiff, formal postures and serious expressions. They were literally holding still for the camera. But as Dr. Palmer examined the photograph more closely, certain details began to seem unusual, even for the formal constraints of Victorian photography. The girl's posture was extraordinarily rigid, not just formally stiff, but almost unnaturally straight, as if something was supporting her from behind. Her hand in the boy's grasp appeared to be positioned carefully, almost artificially, rather than naturally held. The boy's expression troubled Dr. Palmer. It wasn't just solemn, it was grief-stricken. His eyes were definitely red and swollen, as if he had been crying immediately before the photograph was taken. For a formal portrait, this seemed odd. Families usually waited until children looked composed before taking expensive photographs. Most strangely, when Dr. Palmer used a magnifying glass to examine the girl's face more closely, her eyes looked odd. They were open, yes, but they had a glassy, unfocused quality that seemed different from the boy's direct gaze. There was no life in them, no focus, no awareness. Dr. Palmer felt an uncomfortable suspicion beginning to form. She had catalogued hundreds of Victorian photographs in her career, including some types of images that modern viewers found disturbing. She knew that the Victorians had photographic practices that seem shocking today, but were common then. She submitted the photograph for digital restoration with a specific request. Please enhance all details, especially the background and any objects that might be partially visible behind the subjects. I need to see everything that's hidden by fading. Dr. James Mitchell, the digital restoration specialist, began his careful work on the Smith children's photograph. As he enhanced the image, recovering details that had faded over 127 years, he started to notice things that made him increasingly uneasy. The first strange detail to emerge was in the background. The photograph had appeared to show the children against a plain, dark backdrop, standard for Victorian studio photography. But as Dr. Mitchell enhanced the background contrast, shapes began to emerge. Behind the girl, partially hidden by the fading and the dark backdrop, there appeared to be some kind of structure or support. It looked like a metal stand or frame positioned directly behind her. Victorian photographers did sometimes use posing stands to help subjects remain still during long exposures. They were common equipment in studios. But this stand seemed to be positioned very specifically, very close to the girl's back, as if it wasn't just helping her stand still, but actually holding her upright. When Dr. Mitchell enhanced the girl's clothing and posture at maximum magnification, more disturbing details appeared. The back of her dress showed what appeared to be some kind of support or frame beneath the fabric, something rigid that was keeping her body in an unnaturally erect position. Her arms hung at her sides with an artificial stiffness that seemed wrong, even accounting for Victorian formality. Her hand, held by her brother, showed particularly odd details when enhanced. The positioning of her fingers looked carefully arranged rather than naturally held. There was no tension in the hand, no natural grip. It appeared to be completely limp, with the boy's hand doing all the work of maintaining the connection. Most disturbingly, when Dr. Mitchell enhanced the girl's face and eyes, what he saw made him stop and immediately call Dr. Palmer. The girl's eyes were indeed open, but the enhanced image revealed details that had been invisible in the faded original. Her eyes had a glassy, reflective quality. They appeared to be staring, but not seeing. The pupils weren't focused on the camera or on anything else. They had the vacant, fixed appearance of someone not consciously looking at anything. Moreover, when Dr. Mitchell examined the eyes at extreme magnification, he noticed something else. They appeared to have been manually positioned. There were subtle indications that the eyelids had been held or propped open, and possibly that the eyes themselves had been adjusted after being opened. "Dr. Palmer," Dr. Mitchell said when she arrived to see the enhanced images, "I think you need to look at this, and I think you need to tell me what you already suspect this photograph shows." Dr. Palmer studied the enhanced images for several minutes in silence. Then she said quietly, "I think this is a memorial photograph. I think the girl is deceased, and the family hired a photographer to take a final portrait of the boy with his sister." Dr. Mitchell looked shocked. "You mean she's dead in this photograph? But her eyes are open. She's standing up." "That's what makes this particularly unusual," Dr. Palmer said. "Victorian memorial photography was common. When someone died, especially a child, families would often have a photograph taken as a keepsake. But usually the deceased was photographed lying down or with eyes closed, posed as if sleeping. This appears to be an attempt to make the girl look alive, or at least more lifelike. The eyes being open, the upright position, these were techniques some photographers used to make memorial photographs less obviously post-mortem." "But that's..." Dr. Mitchell struggled to find words. "That seems shocking to us, yes," Dr. Palmer said. "But you have to understand the context. In the 1890s, child mortality was tragically high. Many families, especially poor families, would never have any photograph of their child except for a memorial photograph taken after death. This might be the only image this family had of their daughter, and they wanted to remember her as she had been in life, standing with her brother, eyes open. Not as a corpse. To understand the Smith family photograph, Dr. Palmer began researching both the practice of Victorian memorial photography and the specific family history. Memorial or post-mortem photography became common in the mid-19th century, shortly after photography itself was invented. In an era when death was a frequent visitor to every household, when diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, typhoid, and tuberculosis killed thousands of children every year, families desperately wanted some way to remember their lost loved ones. For many families, especially working-class families, a memorial photograph was the only photograph they would ever have of their child. Professional photography was expensive, and families couldn't afford to have casual portraits taken. But when a child died, many families would scrape together the money for one final photograph, a permanent record that their beloved child had existed, had been real, had been theirs. The practice varied widely. Some memorial photographs showed the deceased lying in a coffin or bed, eyes closed, posed peacefully as if sleeping. Others showed the dead child surrounded by flowers or held by family members. Some photographers specialized in making memorial photographs look as lifelike as possible, posing the deceased in chairs, propping eyes open, even tinting the cheeks to add color. The photograph of Thomas and Mary Smith appeared to be an example of this lifelike approach. Research into Yorkshire photography studios of the 1890s revealed that several local photographers advertised memorial photography services, including natural posing and lifelike memorial portraits. Dr. Palmer then investigated the Smith family itself. Using census records, death certificates, and parish registers from Yorkshire, she was able to piece together their tragic story. The family lived in a working-class neighborhood in Bradford, Yorkshire. The father, William Smith, worked in a textile mill. The mother, Elizabeth Smith, worked part-time as a laundress. They had 5 children, of whom Thomas and Mary were the oldest and youngest. Death certificates revealed the tragedy. Mary Elizabeth Smith died on March 12, 1897, at age 6 years and 4 months. Cause of death: diphtheria. Diphtheria was one of the great killers of Victorian children. The bacterial infection caused a thick coating to form in the throat, making it difficult to breathe and swallow. Before the development of antitoxin treatment, which was just becoming available in the 1890s, diphtheria killed approximately 50% of infected children. Death usually came from suffocation, as the throat swelling blocked the airway. The photograph was taken on March 13, 1897, one day after Mary's death. This timing was typical for memorial photography. Bodies had to be photographed quickly before decomposition that made it difficult to achieve a lifelike appearance. Many memorial photographs were taken within 24 to 48 hours of death. Parish records showed that Mary was buried on March 15, 1897, in the family plot at the local cemetery. The grave marker, which still exists today, reads, Mary Elizabeth Smith, 1890 to 1897, beloved daughter and sister, taken too soon. Further research revealed that the photograph was taken by a photographer named George Harrison, who operated a studio in Bradford and advertised memorial photography as one of his services. Harrison's business records, preserved in local archives, included an entry for March 13, 1897. Memorial portrait, Smith family, special posing, with a fee of 7 shillings, a considerable expense for a working-class family in 1897, equivalent to about £50 or $65 in modern currency. The special posing notation likely referred to the standing pose with eyes open, more complex and time-consuming than a simple repose photograph, and therefore more expensive. For the Smith family, this photograph represented a significant financial sacrifice. But it also represented something invaluable. The last image of their daughter. The last time Thomas could hold his sister's hand. And a permanent record that Mary had existed and had been loved. As Dr. Mitchell continued enhancing the photograph, more evidence accumulated that confirmed this was indeed a post-mortem portrait, and revealed just how carefully it had been staged to appear lifelike. The metal support stand behind Mary became clearly visible in the enhanced image. It was a specialized piece of equipment called a standing support, or posing stand, a metal frame with adjustable clamps that could be positioned behind a subject to hold them upright. These were used in regular photography to help people remain still during long exposures. But in memorial photography, they served a more necessary function, actually supporting the weight of the deceased and keeping the body in an upright position. The stand in the photograph appeared to have clamps positioned at Mary's back and possibly at her neck, hidden by her hair and collar, literally holding her body upright. Without this support, a deceased person cannot stand. There is no muscle tension, no balance, no ability to remain upright. The enhanced image also revealed details of Mary's dress that told their own story. The back of her dress showed bulges and irregularities, suggesting that additional support structures were hidden beneath the fabric, possibly boards or frames to keep her torso rigid and properly positioned. Most significantly, when Dr. Mitchell examined Mary's face at extreme magnification, the evidence of post-mortem posing became undeniable. Her eyes, while open, showed clear signs of artificial positioning. The eyelids appeared to be held open by small props or possibly by the photographer's fingers positioned just outside the frame during exposure, then carefully removed and the image retouched. Victorian memorial photographers developed various techniques for achieving open eyes in post-mortem portraits, sometimes using special eye caps that held lids open, sometimes manually positioning them during the photograph and then releasing them. Mary's eyes also showed the distinctive glassy, unfocused appearance of death. No matter how carefully positioned, a deceased person's eyes cannot focus or track movement. They reflect light differently than living eyes. The cornea begins to cloud within hours of death. giving the eyes a slightly opaque, glassy quality visible in the enhanced photograph. Her skin tone, visible even in the black and white photograph, appeared slightly off. The enhanced image showed that her face was paler than her brother's, with a waxy quality. Victorian photographers sometimes applied makeup to deceased subjects to add color, but this photograph appeared to show Mary without such enhancement, her natural post-mortem pallor visible. The positioning of her hands told their own story. Her right hand hung completely limp at her side with no muscle tension whatsoever. Her left hand, held by Thomas, showed fingers that were positioned but not gripping. All the work of maintaining the handhold was being done by Thomas, whose grip can be seen to be firm and careful in the enhanced image. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the enhanced details of Thomas himself. The restoration revealed that his eyes were not just red, but actually tear-stained. Moisture tracks were visible on his cheeks, suggesting he had been crying immediately before or even during the photograph. His expression was one of profound grief, barely held in check. His grip on Mary's hand was tender but desperate. The enhanced image showed the whiteness of his knuckles, the tension in his fingers, the way he was holding on as if trying to keep her with him just a little longer. Background details that became visible in the enhanced image added final confirmation. Partially visible to the left side of the frame were what appeared to be flowers, white lilies, traditional funeral flowers. And in the far background, barely visible even in the enhanced image, were two adult figures, almost certainly the parents, William and Elizabeth Smith, standing in the background, witnessing this final portrait of their children together. The photograph had been carefully composed to focus on the children while minimizing visible evidence of death, but the enhanced restoration revealed the full reality. This was a memorial photograph, a final farewell, a desperate attempt by a grieving family to preserve one last image of their daughter as she had been in life, standing, properly dressed, with her beloved brother holding her hand. When the fully restored photograph was presented to Dr. Palmer, along with all the historical research and evidence, the complete tragic story finally came together. This was indeed a post-mortem memorial photograph. Mary Smith had died of diphtheria on March 12, 1897, at age 6. The next day, March 13th, her family brought her body to photographer George Harrison's studio for a final portrait. They requested a special, more expensive type of memorial photograph, one where Mary would appear standing and lifelike, with her eyes open, holding hands with her brother Thomas. The photographer used all the techniques available in 1897 to achieve this effect. Mary's body was supported by a metal stand hidden behind her. Her posture was maintained by support structures beneath her dress. Her eyes were manually opened and positioned. She was dressed in her best white dress, likely the same dress she would be buried in. Thomas, age 10, was positioned beside her to hold her hand one final time. The photograph took considerable time to set up and expose properly. Thomas had to stand absolutely still, holding his dead sister's hand, while the photographer arranged everything, made adjustments, and then exposed the photographic plate. The exposure itself probably took 30 to 60 seconds, an eternity to stand frozen, holding the hand of your deceased sister, trying not to cry, trying to stay still enough not to blur the image. The result was what the family wanted, a photograph where Mary appeared to be standing, dressed beautifully, with her brother. A final image that showed her as they wanted to remember her, not as a corpse in a coffin, but as a child who had lived and been loved. For modern viewers, this practice seems shocking, even macabre. The idea of posing a dead child to look alive, of photographing a corpse with open eyes, of having a living child hold hands with their deceased sibling. All of this seems disturbing to contemporary sensibilities. But in 1897, this was an act of love and desperation, not morbidity. Child mortality in Victorian England was catastrophically high. Approximately 15 to 20% of children died before age 5. Diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, and tuberculosis killed thousands of children every year. Every family lived with the constant fear of losing a child, and most families actually experienced it. For the Smith family, a working-class family living in a Yorkshire textile town, Mary's death, while devastating, was not unusual. They likely knew other families who had lost children. They may have lost children themselves before. Infant mortality was even higher than childhood mortality. What was unusual was having any photograph at all. Photography in 1897 was still expensive enough that most working-class families couldn't afford casual portraits. The 7 shillings the Smiths paid for Mary's memorial photograph represented significant sacrifice, probably a week's wages or more for the family. But for them, it was worth it. This photograph would be the only image they had of Mary. Without it, they would have no visual record that she had existed, only memory, which fades and becomes unreliable over time. The photograph provided something permanent, something they could look at when they wanted to remember exactly how she looked. Proof that she had been real, that she had been theirs. The practice of posing Mary standing with open eyes, while shocking to us, was likely meant as a comfort to the family. They wanted to remember her as she had been in life, a girl who stood, who looked, who held her brother's hand. Not as a corpse, not as death, as their Mary, preserved forever in the moment before she was gone. Thomas's presence in the photograph adds another layer of meaning. This was not just a portrait of Mary, it was a portrait of their relationship. The hand-holding gesture suggests that Thomas and Mary had been close, that he had been a protective older brother. The photograph gave him and the family a permanent record of that relationship, a final image of them together. The photograph of Thomas and Mary Smith, when understood in its full context, becomes something more than just a Victorian curiosity or a shocking example of past practices. It becomes a document of love, grief, and the universal human need to hold on to what we've lost, to preserve memory, to make permanent what is frighteningly temporary. When families in 1897 said, "We'll always have the photograph," they meant it literally. It was all they would have, the only proof their child had lived, the only image they could look at, the only way to show future generations what their lost child had looked like. The National Portrait Gallery now displays the restored photograph of Thomas and Mary Smith, with a caption explaining its nature as a memorial photograph. The image is used in exhibitions about Victorian childhood mortality and the history of memorial photography. Dr. Palmer notes that modern viewers often find the photograph disturbing at first. But then, when they understand the context, the grief, the poverty, the desperation to have something to remember, they often find it heartbreaking rather than macabre. These families weren't being morbid or strange, Dr. Palmer explains. They were doing the best they could with what they had. They were preserving love the only way available to them. When you understand that, this photograph becomes less about death and more about the lengths people will go to remember the ones they've lost. Thomas Smith, the boy in the photograph, lived to age 67, dying in 1954. He never forgot his sister Mary. Family records show he visited her grave regularly throughout his life and told his own children stories about the little sister he lost when he was 10. The photograph, carefully preserved by the family for over a century, remained his most treasured possession. The last moment he held his sister's hand.